This is a short biography of the insurrectionary anarchist communist Luigi Galleani. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Luigi Galleani was the leading Italian anarchist in the United States of America, one of the greatest anarchist orators of his time, along with Emma Goldman and Johann Most. He was the editor of the foremost Italian-American anarchist periodical La Cronica Subversiva, the Subversive Chronicle, which ran for 15 years before its suppression by the US government. Galleani was the inspirer of a movement that included Sacco and Vanzetti among its adherents, yet he and his ideas have for a long time been overlooked. Luigi Galleani is an interesting, curious figure of anarchism. His conception of anarchist communism combined the insurrectionary anarchism expounded by the German individualist Max Stirner with the mutual aid advocated by the Russian anarchist communist Peter Kropotkin. He defended the principles of revolutionary spontaneity, autonomy, diversity, self-determination, and direct action, and advocated for the violent overthrow of the state and capitalism through propaganda of the deed. He rejected all forms of formal organisation, including anarchist federations and labour unions, and opposed participation in the labour movement, as he believed it was inherently reformist and susceptible to corruption. From his rejection of reformism, he concluded that social change could only be brought about through violent attacks against institutions, which he believed could build towards a popular insurrection. As such, he publicly endorsed what he called propaganda of the deed, which came in the form of the assassination of authority figures and the expropriation of private property. Galleani defended both the assassination of the US President William McKinley and the assassination of King Umberto I of Italy. In his own words, his ultimate aim was to establish, quote, a society without masters, without government, without law, without any coercive control, a society functioning on the basis of mutual agreement and allowing each member the freedom to enjoy absolute autonomy, end quote. But he also rejected prefigurative politics, such as that advocated by anarcho-syndicalists, as he believed that people themselves would instinctively understand how to live freely and equally once the state and capitalism were overthrown. Galleani became disillusioned with the labour movement and came to reject labour unions entirely, instead adopting an anti-organisational form of anarchism, which became the dominant tendency within the Italian-American anarchist movement. He even openly broke with the anarcho-syndicalist Carlo Tresca over his cooperation with the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. Galleani gained many highly committed comrades who likewise rejected all formal organisation and developed markedly militant tendencies. These people apparently included Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who promoted Galleani's lectures and distributed his literature. Galleani's comrades, following his anti-organisational principles, formed small, tight-knit groups made up of self-selecting individuals who rejected formal leadership. Galleani was born on the 12th of August 1861 in the Piedmont town of Vercelli, not far from the city of Turin. The son of middle-class parents, he was drawn to anarchism in his late teens and, studying law at the University of Turin, became an outspoken militant whose hatred of capitalism and government would burn with undiminished intensity for the rest of his life. Galleani, however, refused to practice law, which he had come to regard with contempt, transferring his talents and energies to radical propaganda. Under threat of prosecution, he took refuge in France, from which he was expelled for taking part in a May Day demonstration. Moving to Switzerland, he visited the exiled French anarchist and geographer Elise Reclus, who he assisted in the preparation of his Nouvelle Géographie Universelle, compiling statistics on Central America. He also assisted students at the University of Geneva in arranging a celebration in honor of the Haymarket martyrs, who had been hanged in Chicago in 1887, for which he was expelled as a dangerous agitator. Returning to Italy, Galleani continued his agitation, which got him into trouble with the police following the state repression after food riots in Milan. Arrested on charges of conspiracy, he spent more than 5 years in prison and exile before escaping from the island of Pantelleria off the coast of Sicily in 1900. Galleani, now in his 40th year, began an odyssey that landed him in North America. Aided by Elise Reclus and other comrades, he first made his way to Egypt, where he lived for the better part of a year among a colony of Italian expatriates. Threatened with extradition, he moved on to London, from which he soon embarked for the United States, arriving in October 1901, barely a month after the assassination of President McKinley. Settling in Paterson, New Jersey, a stronghold of the immigrant anarchist movement, Galleani assumed the editorship of La Questione Sociale, the Social Question, then the leading Italian anarchist periodical in America. Scarcely had he installed himself in this position when a strike erupted among the Paterson silk workers, and Galleani, braving the anti-radical hysteria which followed the shooting of President McKinley, threw all his energies into their cause. In eloquent and fiery speeches, he called on the workers to launch a general strike and thereby free themselves from capitalist oppression. Paul Guyot, a visitor from France, was present at one such oration. Quote, "I have never heard an orator more powerful than Luigi Galleani." End quote. He afterwards wrote, quote, "He has a marvellous facility with words, accompanied by the faculty, rare among popular tribunes, of precision and clarity of ideas. His voice is full of warmth, his glance alive and penetrating, his gestures of exceptional vigour and flawless distinction." End quote. The strike occurred in June 1902. Clashes took place between the workers and the police, shots were fired, and Galleani was wounded in the face. Indicted for inciting to riot, he managed to escape to Canada. A short time after, having recovered from his wounds, he secretly recrossed the border and took refuge in Barre, Vermont, living under an assumed name among his anarchist comrades, who regarded him with intense respect and devotion. It was in Barre on the 6th of June 1903 that Galleani launched La Cronaca Subversiva, the mouthpiece for his incendiary ideas and one of the most important and ably edited periodicals in the history of the anarchist movement. Its influence, reaching far beyond the confines of the United States, could be felt wherever Italian radicals congregated, from Europe and North America to South America and Australia. In 1906, however, during a polemical exchange with G. M. Cerati, the socialist editor of Il Proletario in New York, the latter actually revealed Galleani's whereabouts, a charge also in fact levelled at the English writer H. G. Wells, and Galleani was taken into custody. Extradited to New Jersey, he was tried in Paterson in April 1907 for his role in the 1902 strike. The trial, however, ended in a hung jury and Galleani was set free. He returned to Barre and resumed his propaganda activities. Now in his late 40s, he had reached the summit of his intellectual powers. Over the next 40 years, his fiery oratory and brilliant pen carried him to a position of undisputed leadership within the Italian-American anarchist movement. An eloquent speaker, Galleani had a resonant, lilting voice with a tremolo that kept his audience spellbound. He spoke easily, powerfully, spontaneously, and his bearing was of a kind that made his followers, Sacco and Vanzetti among them, revere him as an important, knowledgeable person of the movement, to which he won more people than any other single individual. Galliani was also a prolific writer, pouring forth hundreds of articles, essays, and pamphlets that reached tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of readers on several continents. Yet he never produced a full-length book. The volumes appearing over his signature, such as Faccia a Faccia coi Nemico, Analiti e Singulti, and Figuri e Figuri, are collections of shorter pieces previously published in La Cronica Subversiva. In this respect, Galliani resembles Johann Most, Enrico Malatesta, and Benjamin Tucker, authors of Instead of a Book by a Man Too Busy to Write One, rather than, say, William Godwin, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, or Peter Kropotkin. The End of Anarchism, Galliani's most fully realized work, itself began as a series of articles. In June 1907, shortly after Galliani's acquittal at Paterson, the Turin daily La Stampa published an interview with Francesco Saverio Mellino, himself a former anarchist of distinction, under the title The End of Anarchism. Mellino, like Galliani, had been trained in law, had lived in the United States, and had founded an important Italian-American journal, Grido degli Oppressi, The Cry of the Oppressed, which appeared in New York from 1892 to 1894. Unlike Galliani, however, Mellino had abandoned anarchism in 1897, joining the socialist movement. Mellino, in his interview with La Stampa, pronounced anarchism as an obsolete doctrine, torn by internal disputes, bereft of first-rate theorists, and doomed to early extinction. Galliani was incensed. The end of anarchism, he asked in La Cronica Subversiva, adding a question mark to the title of Mellino's interview. Just the opposite was the case. In an age of growing political and economic centralization, anarchism was more relevant than ever. Far from being moribund, quote, it lives, it develops, it goes forward, end quote. Such was Galliani's reply to Mellino, elaborated in a series of articles in Cronaca Subversiva from the 17th of August 1907 to the 25th of January 1908. Combining the spirit of Stirnerian insurgency with Kropotkin's principle of mutual aid, Galliani put forward a vigorous defense of communist anarchism against socialism and reform, preaching the virtues of spontaneity and variety, of autonomy and independence, of self-determination and direct action in a world of increasing standardization and conformity. A dedicated, passionate revolutionary, he would brook no compromise with the elimination of both capitalism and the state, nothing less than a clean sweep of the bourgeois order with its inequality and injustice, its subjugation and degradation of the workers, would satisfy his thirst for the millennium. Galliani produced 10 articles in response to Mellino. He intended to write still more, but day-to-day work for the movement, such as editing La Cronaca Subversiva, organizing meetings, issuing pamphlets, embarking on coast-to-coast lecture tours, prevented him from doing so. In 1912, he moved La Cronaca Subversiva from Bar to Lynn, Massachusetts, where he had won dedicated comrades. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he opposed it, in contrast to Kropotkin, with all the strength and eloquence at his command, denouncing the war in La Cronaca Subversiva with an oft-repeated slogan: against the war, against peace, for the social revolution. With America's entry into the conflict in April 1917, Galliani became the object of persecution. His paper was shut down, and he himself was arrested on charges of obstructing the war effort. On the 24th of June 1919, he was deported to Italy, leaving behind his wife and 4 children. In Turin, Galliani resumed publication of La Cronaca Subversiva. As in America, however, it was suppressed by the authorities. On Mussolini's accession to power in 1922, Galliani was arrested, tried and convicted on charges of sedition and sentenced to 14 months in prison, where his health began to deteriorate. After his release, he returned to his old polemic against Molino, completing it in a series of articles in La Adunata dei Refrattari, The Call of the Rebels, the journal of his comrades in America, who issued it in 1925 as a booklet. In this year, Enrico Malatesta hailed The End of Anarchism as a key text of communist anarchism that was, in his words, quote, clear, serene, and eloquent, end quote. The publication of the La Adunata edition of this work in 1925 did not endear Galliani to the Mussolini government. Arrested in November 1926, Galliani was locked up in the same cell in which he had spent 3 months in 1892 and found it as dirty and ugly as before. Soon afterwards he was banished to the island of Lipari off the Sicilian coast, from which he was later removed to Messina and condemned to serve 6 months in prison for the crime of insulting Mussolini. In February 1930, Galliani, in failing health, was allowed to return to the mainland. Retiring to the mountain village of Caprigliola, he remained under the surveillance of the police, who seldom left his door and followed him even on his solitary walks in the surrounding countryside. Returning from his walk on the 4th of November 1931, Galliani collapsed and died. His anarchism to the end had burned with an undiminished flame. Ever hopeful for the future, despite bitter experience, he had remained faithful to the ideas which had inspired his life, convinced that liberty would ultimately triumph over tyranny and oppression. And I'll leave some relevant links in the description. Thank you for listening. All the best.